Dear colleague, I am Pierre Quiblier, the coordinator of the SAICM Secretariat, and it is a great pleasure for me today to welcome you to this community of practice discussions, this chemicals and waste management community of practice discussions. And just few weeks, few days now before the beginning of our ICCM5 conference, it is a great pleasure to focus our attentions today on this very important element of our ICCM5 expected discussions, reporting and capacity building for the implementations of the Beyond 2020 framework instruments. Capacity building and reporting features prominently in all the discussions at the intersessional process that we've had so far, whether in the targets or in the financial dimensions or within the programmatic areas. All the capacity building and reporting is an element of the greatest importance and to which all our stakeholders have their views. So today's discussion is the fourth in a series of discussion of a series of discussion that were held in 2023 on issues of concerns, chemicals of concerns across diverse supply chain, capacity building, and other relevant topics. These discussions that were led by the SAICM Secretariat. The first discussion was on integrated chemicals and waste management in the lead up to the 5th International Conference, ICCM5, especially on national systems, industry actions, and SDGs implementations, the three dimensions that are keys in the programmatic framework envisaged to be adopted at ICCM5. The second discussion was on the best practices for responsible chemicals and waste management in companies and small and medium enterprises. And the third discussion was on chemicals in plastics, taking a deep dive into compositions, recyclability, and policy implications. The recording and the discussion summary of all three discussions previous to this one are available on the Green Forum. Please, you can access them using the link shared through the chat. To remind you of this community of practice in 2020, SAICM established four community of practices, one on highly hazardous pesticides, one in chemicals in products, one in lead and paint, and one on chemicals and the Sustainable Development Goals. They have led all to very successful knowledge and information exchanges. While the activities of this community came to an end in 2022, the SAICM Secretariat is continuing the momentum with a single, all-inclusive community of practice on chemicals and waste management in partnership with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, which we thanks very much. The Chemicals and Waste Management Community of Practice has been established on the Green Forum to host ongoing activities, knowledge exchanged before, during, and after this discussion session. Today, to support and lead us in this discussion, we benefit from the great expertise of two wonderful colleagues from our UNEP WCMC, Jerry Harrison and Marina Venancio. And I will let them now introduce you to the work that they have done in support of this very important issues related to reporting and capacity building.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Pierre, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today and for the opportunity to present those two information documents on capacity building, which were developed by the Secretariat working in close coordination with UNEP WCMC. For the first part of the session, I'll briefly provide an overview of the format and content of these two documents and allowing for time for discussion and exchange around capacity building issues. Before I start, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context So following the approval of the SAICM Programme of Work for the period 2021-2023, the SAICM Secretariat has initiated a process to explore options to develop a capacity building strategy for the implementation of the new framework instruments for the sound management of chemicals and waste. Within the scenario, this first information document outlines a series of key messages and recommendations for the development of such a strategy. As you can see here on your screen, the document contains 5 substantive sections from 2 to 6. The first one provides an introduction to concepts, approaches, and modalities of capacity building more broadly. It is followed by a section that provides an overview of the current experience in capacity building under the strategic approach. This includes, for example, key mandates and decisions, such as the overarching policy strategy and the global plan of action, relevant institutional programs, such as the Quick Start program, and examples of projects and initiatives led by SAICM stakeholders. Section 4 of this document discusses key messages from the stakeholder consultations that were convened by UNEP-WCMC and the Secretariat early in 2023 to learn more about stakeholders' perceptions regarding needs and priorities for capacity building in the context of the Beyond 2020 instrument. Section 5 provides examples of mechanisms and instruments that were developed under multilateral environmental agreements to deliver capacity building and could provide some food for thought for an instrument on capacity building for SAICM. And finally, Section 6 draws key recommendations for a more coordinated approach to capacity building for the new framework instrument. To allow for more discussion time today, we'll not get into details about each one of these sections in this presentation, but instead we'll just focus on key definitions, challenges, and priorities identified by the stakeholders during the consultations, as well as some key recommendations. So as you can see here on the slide, regarding terminology, it is important to note that there's not a multilaterally agreed definition of capacity building. But for the purposes of our discussions today, we define capacity building as the process of developing and strengthening the skills, abilities, processes, and resources for the sound management of chemicals and waste. Capacity building, as we outline in the document, should be a continuous and demand-driven process tailored to specific contexts and build on specific and existing initiatives focused on bringing about change in the long run. It should also operate at different levels, including the individual level, the organizational level, and the enabling environment level, which includes, for example, policy, legal, and institutional frameworks. As Pierre mentioned, capacity building has been a central component of the strategic approach since its inception. And this is reflected in a number of resolutions from the International Conference on Chemicals Management, and also in the terms of reference for the Quick Start program. So, as I mentioned before, in the process of developing this information document, a series of consultations were convened to gather the initial views and thoughts of stakeholders regarding capacity building challenges, needs, and priorities. And in general, the inputs that we received from interviewees could be organized into 7 groups of challenges faced by stakeholders while engaging in the design, development, and implementation of capacity building activities and interventions. And this include, for example, a lack of a comprehensive framework for capacity building, certain limitations in the engagement and outreach of other sectors beyond the environment sector, oftentimes the limited availability and access to funding and financing for capacity building activities, the lack of clarity concerning the roles of certain stakeholders and focal points, the duplication of effort and limited collaboration between different stakeholders, and also difficulties in collecting data, accessing, and sharing information. To address the 7 groups of challenges, the analysis of the consultation outcomes identified a number of key priorities and suggestions. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through in detail over these priorities and suggestions, but it's worth mentioning some of them. For example, the need to understand capacity building as this iterative, continuous, and long-term process that should be country-driven, demand-driven, and more importantly, build on existing knowledge and initiatives as appropriate. importance to develop a capacity building strategy to support the implementation and delivery of the new framework instrument that is aligned to the strategic objectives, priorities, targets, indicators, and issues of concern established by the new instrument. Besides that, stakeholders also mentioned the need to make interlinkages to other legal and policy frameworks that go beyond the chemicals and waste cluster. And this includes not only multilateral environmental agreements, but also international human rights instruments, International Labour Organization conventions, and other frameworks from other sectors like the agricultural sector. And also the importance of promoting meaningful engagement and increased representation of other sectors in the implementation of such a strategy. On resources, interviewees mentioned the need to explore innovative options for a robust new financial mechanism or a similar instrument to fund the capacity building strategy and activities under the new framework instrument for capacity building, and also mobilize resources and substantially increase the level of funding for capacity building activities. I want to stop for a moment in this slide, because I think this is particularly relevant for our discussions today. A number of stakeholders highlighted during the interview the lack of clarity regarding roles and responsibilities and expectations for focal points to the strategy, as well limited availability of onboarding for the role. Similarly, a number of stakeholders underscored the lack of clearly defined roles for stakeholders in the implementation of capacity building strategies. And then a number of suggestions were made, such as building a collective understanding among stakeholders concerning the role and implementation of the new framework, the promotion of meaningful engagement of underrepresented groups, including through the establishment of some institutional mechanisms for that, the need to harness the experience of grassroots and other civil society organizations, and also the need to clearly define the roles and responsibilities, not only of focal points, but also other stakeholders in the delivery of capacity building interventions. And before I wrap up in relation to this document, it's important to note that it outlines a number of considerations and recommendations to inform these discussions around capacity building components to the new framework instrument. And these considerations and recommendations are in the final section of the document and organized into 16 different categories, as you can see in the slide. You can read more about them in detail in the document, but one of the bottom line key messages deriving from the analysis of stakeholder inputs and the literature review is the need for a more coordinated approach to capacity building for the sound management of chemicals and waste under the new instrument. And this could, for example, be done and facilitated through a capacity building strategy that integrates this idea of a whole of society and whole of government approach, builds on existing initiatives and experience, address different capacities, and clearly define roles and responsibilities. I'll just stop right here and move on to the second document relating to capacity building, which you can see now on your screen. This document was also developed in response to the Programme of Work and Budget 2021-2023 for the SAICM Secretariat. And the annex to this document identified core components or elements, if you will, that the International Conference on Chemicals Management may wish to consider in the development of the capacity building strategy. So based on the previous document, the stakeholder consultations, and the need for this integrated approach to capacity building, it provides an outline with 11 sections or categories of issues that could be further discussed and potentially integrated into capacity building strategy. So as you can see here on your screen, this includes an introduction to the mandate to develop a capacity building strategy, the rationale and purpose and scope for such a strategy, the definition of key terms to support building a common ground for identifying and delivering capacity building interventions. And this encompasses, for example, definitions of capacity building, the difference between capacity building approaches and modalities, technical capacities, functional capacities. This draft element also introduces a series of draft objectives and capacity building principles, priorities, institutional arrangements, and more importantly, means of implementation and monitoring, review, and reporting. All in all essential components that would make for a robust strategy. And without further ado, and just to allow for more time for discussion, I'll just stop right here and hand over the floor back to my colleague Pierre, who will moderate the discussion based on the few documents. So Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marina, for this very good presentations. And we see here in a snapshot, but all these very important elements that makes this chemicals management so complex, and the related capacity building needs that needs to be addressed. You presented very well the challenges and the opportunities that are there. Among these challenges is, and this is our question one, how can diverse stakeholders from various sectors, including intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, and individuals involved in the sound management of chemicals, be more effectively engaged in the development and implementation of a capacity building strategy for the new framework instrument? What type of roles should each stakeholders play in the development and implementation of the new framework instrument? Our old SAICM, that is defined by its intersectoral and multi-stakeholder nature, how can we make that really alive? How can we activate at its full potential this multi-stakeholders intersectoral nature of SAICM within the definition of our new framework instruments and its implementations? That is key. And we will be very pleased to hear your suggestions. We need to be solution-oriented, and now you have this opportunity to provide your solutions to these very important questions on how do we broaden the involvement of all the stakeholders in our sound management of chemicals and waste. And I think you will be able to provide, Marina, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can now provide all your input to these questions within the chat discussion. And we could perhaps do a poll. And you see the poll, the questions: how do you perceive the effectiveness of the SAICM's capacity building efforts from 2006 to 2016? That could perhaps trigger more ideas and suggestions with regards to the need to broaden our participations and involvement in our efforts. So do you perceive the effectiveness of the SAICM capacity building efforts so far as highly successful, somewhat successful, but limited in reach, neutral, neither particularly successful nor unsuccessful? You see them unsuccessful due to a lack of structural approach and consistency, or you cannot comment due to insufficient data and awareness? And we see here already in one of the comments, a very important aspect related to the involvement of the private sector to the list of stakeholders. And that's a very important factor of success if we want to successfully implement our new framework. And this is fully taken into considerations. We see as well with the private sector the health component that should be strengthened, using health in all policies. Another big factor of success, if we can bring health along with the environment to take the lead in bringing forward the importance of addressing our chemicals management challenges. That is very important if we could mobilize health and the environment as catalytic forces to bring the other sectors on board along with the agriculture, industry, and others. And as an example of the greater involvement and the response to the SAICM calls to have greater involvement of the private sector, we see here the proposal of Alejandra on the dynamic involvement of ICCA in drafting a proposal for establishing a capacity building hub at ICCM5 that aligns with the challenges and objectives highlighted. And there will be also a webinar that will be held very soon and whose information is available on SAICM site right now. And I would invite all those interested as well in capacity building to attend this webinar. And here we have the response to the question of our pool, question 1. And we see that we are reasonably successful. We have a very kind audience, but we remain limited, and that's very, very true. We are sure that we haven't been highly successful, and we hope that we will correct that with our new instruments. And there's some recognitions that we have been unsuccessful, and we have also to consider that. We see some support indeed for having health and environment to take the lead in achieving mutual goals. This we could perhaps also discuss a little bit on how this common work, joint work between health and environment should be oriented. There's great potential here in sharing data and being able to build a business case for attracting the attention of other sectors in bringing some figures and numbers that speaks more directly to some decision makers on the importance to manage adequately our chemicals and waste. And the linkages also we have here in between other big agendas such as climate change. There is also with biodiversity. All these needs to be taken into considerations. We have to also realize that we, the chemicals and waste agenda, remains a little bit the poor cousin of more prominent agendas such as biodiversity and climate change. We aim at correcting this disbalance with our upcoming ICCM5, and we will have to highlight the linkages with these other big issues. and with the hope that it will trigger also greater financing means that will be provided to us.
And just to complement that, there's some really interesting comments about engagement of the health sector and other sectors. And I think this is something that was really clear from the stakeholder consultations that were convened earlier this year. So also not only the health sector, but also the labor sector, and how different actors can be effectively engaged in the implementation and design of such a strategy. And in the information document, there is also a section on interesting initiatives from different stakeholder groups. So I see a mention to the private sector, and there is also a couple of paragraphs of some really interesting initiatives, which can be really food for thought of what can be developed in the future.
Thank you very much, Marina. Indeed, there's very encouraging signals, both from the private sector and I would say from the other sectors, and particularly through the leadership of the IOMC, this interagency coordination mechanisms to manage chemicals and waste, and bringing all the UN family together in responding to the challenges of the chemicals and waste agenda. They have been extremely active. We've seen also how we aim at shifting the focus a little bit with our new instruments from a chemicals by chemicals perspective to one that would go to main economic and industry sectors. This discussion was led by our colleagues from IOMC. I think it is an extremely constructive contribution to our discussions, and that enlarge our sense of hopes that we will be able to mobilize and to broaden really the involvement of these very important sectors, whether they are labor, whether they are industry, and our colleagues from ILO, from UNIDO, from FAO are very active, very interested. I think the game is a little bit changing, and it is extremely encouraging, but we will have to catalyze it. We will have to make the best of it. We will have to frame it solidly. And with that, it will have to be supported with adequate financial resources as well, because coordinations and cooperation is always praised by everybody, but funded by very few. And this will be our challenge, to be innovative and to find the best avenues for providing support for this goodwill that we see emerging in our discussion recently. Any further comments? Should we turn to the next? There is a second poll. We see here a very interesting with regards to the potential cooperation just before the second poll, the role of the poison centers, and indeed that is in terms of boosting, in terms of strengthening our capacities in terms of assessment, to review with WHO on how to secure the role of the poison center, but perhaps also to enlarge their potential capacities with assessment capacities. Why not, where these sharing of data between the environment, between the various sectors could be brought forward in order to build, as I was speaking before, the business case, in order to enable us to translate these information data from epidemiological sources, toxicological sources, into more economic figures could be very, very interesting. This calls on the sharing of competencies of not only scientists from epidemiological background, but with best economists and lawyers to build also the legal and institutional infrastructure that could respond to the analysis made and turned into an economic figures. That could be very, very interesting. And perhaps the role of poison centers could be enlarged in this direction. That could be consideration very interesting to further explore. Let's turn perhaps to the question 2 that we have in our poll today. What have been some of the most significant barriers to implementing capacity building under SAICM, and how might these be overcome in the Beyond 2020 framework? So what are the barriers in implementing capacity building? Is it financial constraints, where the primary barrier, increased funding, might be the solutions? Is it the lack of technical expertise, with a focus on intensive training and educations could help? Is it limited stakeholder involvement, fostering more partnerships and collaborations might be the answer? Is it all of the above? All of the above barriers were equally significant. And we see the importance of bringing to the attention of the stakeholders the importance of our chemicals and waste agenda. 38% limited stakeholders involvement. Everybody is affected by chemicals and nobody takes the full responsibility of it, or part of the responsibility. That's very interesting. The lack of technical expertise. Perhaps here we could realize that we are not suffering from a lack of information or a lack of technical expertise, but as we were talking before, perhaps a sharing of expertise. That's the lack we are suffering from. And the financial constraints, that is also an important barrier here. Very interesting.
Yeah. Maybe if I can just quickly comment on that, because it's a really interesting result from the polls, because we had extensive discussions with many stakeholders on, for example, financial constraints, also the successes of the Quick Start program, and also the different avenues for funding, like the special program and the JEF. And this was one of the trends that emerged from our consultations in terms of the need for think of maybe like innovative mechanisms or different ways that are also accessible equally to all stakeholders. So I think this was an interesting trend that came from the consultations we had earlier this year. And also the issue of stakeholder involvement, I think, was really positive. That, and one of the trends that came very clearly from the consultations is that stakeholders are really interested in getting actively engaged in capacity building. And there was a discussion on what are the best kind of institutional mechanisms to allow for this active participation, and what type of roles different stakeholders could have in the implementation and delivery of capacity building within the context of SAICM. So I think this is very reflective of some of the discussions we had earlier this year with many stakeholders engaged in SAICM.
Yes, thank you very much, Marina. We could add also some subtleties here in this global perspective, is that we may have to recognize also that the needs are different from regions, and whether you're big producers or big consumers or both of chemicals, whether you're coming from developing countries or developed one, the technical needs and the sharing of technical expertise is not of the same importance as if you're coming from a very poor country, where the finance will be the determining factor in order to achieve these exchange of technical expertise. So there's no choice here. And if you don't have the means, the financial means, there's nothing can happen. And this has to be taken into consideration when we are addressing this issue of capacity building. I think we are not far from from closing this question one, and we could perhaps move to the second item, to the second questions. Reflecting on the draft elements for a capacity building strategy for the Beyond 2020 framework instruments, what additions or modifications would you suggest? What do you see as the key components that should be present in a successful capacity building strategy for the new framework instrument? Maybe Marina, you could refer to the main element of a capacity building strategy. We have referred to them here mainly in terms of assessment capacity, in terms of scientific assessment capacity, informations and data provisions, which is very important. So there are the elements of institutional and legal infrastructure, the capacity to be organized at the national level and to reflect these organizations within the law and its implementations. There are also the element of informations and awareness raising to all kind of public and most vulnerable population. This is also so from assessment to informations through legal and institutional infrastructure. What is there any additions, modifications with these important components? And what are the ones that are key from your perspective? Anything I may have forgotten, Marina? You're muted, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I think you raised some really important components. And when we were discussing this document, I think we're also thinking of like core elements that a strategy could have to facilitate its implementation and also encompass some of the issues that are emerging from the chat as well. Because I see, for example, there were some references to priorities and having some like common priorities for capacity building activities. And this could translate, as you mentioned, in some targeted capacity building for like technical capacities. For example, we had a reference in the chat also to the poison centers and to many technical issues that could be further developed, and there could be further capacity development tailored to those. But also in terms of more capacities, more broadly in terms of legal institutional frameworks to mainstream the sound management of chemicals and waste. So I think that this idea of like maybe having a set of priorities actually was one of the recommendations from the consultations, and it's something that would be really interesting to be further discussed. I think in the context of the elements that we presented a couple of slides ago, there are also, for example, what type of institutional mechanisms there could be within the context of SAICM to help and facilitate the implementation of the strategy, which is another interesting point. I think finance has been also being a trend in the chat discussion as to how is this strategy going to be financed. And for example, I see a comment from a colleague in the chat about the implementation programs for the new framework. So how these implementation programs could be used to better coordinate capacity building activities. So I think there are different dimensions. So priorities in the sense of like technical capacities, but also interesting elements that the strategy could have, or for example, even the discussion if the strategy could have like an action plan to have more tailored and spelled out activities for capacity building. I think that's an interesting discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Marina. We see some feedback from the chat discussion, very interesting on this strategy should also focus on overcoming the challenges that marked our efforts in the past, which is that mainly it's ad hoc, it's opportunistic, it's scattered, it's never fully coherent, poorly coordinated. It would be very important that we develop this strategy that can bring all that where we could report constantly and in a reliable manner on the number of efforts and be able to better coordinate them to show their mutually supportive potential as well. That when you support surveillance system, as we see here, poison centers, that it helps also in building your institutional capacity in large, that it build also, it contributes to make better business case for your interventions, to justify the priority interventions to be made. So you make the case and address at the same time or contribute to the effort for bringing the necessary financial support for these activities, and so aim at having a more sustainable capacity building efforts in the long run. So this capacity we don't have yet, and that's where the role of national focal point, again here, the support that is to be provided by the new framework instrument needs to reflect and to bring that in a more coherent, better coordinated manner. I think there's a lot of reflections being made in this regard, again, by ICCA in their efforts in this regard, by the IOMC, by our colleagues from WCMC. All this needs to be converged and hopefully take hold in our agreement in the next few weeks in Bonn. But the questions are really in the chat. It's really very pertinent, and we see that we are dealing with real knowledgeable audience and experts here, because it's really pertinent suggestions. And we see that it's not just we will have also to deal with legacy issues and not just on making the best in being innovative and preventive type of policy. And I think we will have poll questions now. And the poll questions is as follows. What are your thoughts on the preliminary findings regarding the draft element for a capacity building strategy? So the preliminary findings, what are your thoughts on these preliminary findings regarding the draft element for a capacity building strategy? Do they fully address the requirements and challenges? Do they remain too general and lack specificity? Do they emphasize too much on past strategy with limited forward-looking perspectives? Are they comprehensive but need clearer implementations parameters? Should they involve more grassroots feedback, and perspectives? A few minutes to get the result on this first questions of on this first poll of our second question.
Maybe in the meantime, my colleagues have the chance to have a look at the question. Maybe I can just react to one of the comments in the chat as well about this legacy issues. I think one differentiation that's very useful is the difference between technical capacities and functional capacities. So in terms of technical capacities during the stakeholder consultations, we did hear many stakeholders refer to the poison center, some legacy issues, but also in terms of the need to develop capacities to look for interlinkages between the chemicals and waste cluster with other clusters, which was another technical issue, life cycle approaches, inventory, chemical inventories and registries, risk assessments, monitoring assembly. So I think there are a wide range of like technical capacities that were highlighted by stakeholders in consultations, which is really interesting because these comments also aggregate to this list of technical capacities that we're starting to map. And also in terms of functional capacities, which are capacities, for example, to generate knowledge, to exchange with other stakeholders, to develop legal frameworks, develop institutional frameworks. I think these capacities are also related to many of the challenges and also opportunities that have been mentioned in the chat today. And I think this distinction is quite useful because I think that we need different strategies to build technical capacities and functional capacities. But it's really interesting to see the diversity as well of topics under the context of the SAICM.
Thank you, Marina. I think we should get the result, perhaps, of our poll. As I'm speaking, as they say in the big broadcast. And we see the result here with a great majority for saying that they are comprehensive but need clearer implementations. So that's encouraging. The need to involve more grassroots features also prominently here. And we see that the requirements and challenges remains bigger than the response that is provided. And it seems to be recognized that these elements are forward-looking. Okay, any reflection on this, Marina?
I think the results are really encouraging, and they reflect that consultation is always needed, and consultation and active exchange with the different stakeholder groups. So I think for also the implementation parameters, this is something that we've been discussing in terms of also having like clear like indicators, clear outcomes, clear outputs, so we can also in a way track the development and implementation of the strategy and have like a theory of change that sets the baseline for the development and delivery of capacity building initiatives. So it's really interesting to see this feedback through the survey as well, because it really pushes us to think about this need to have like clear parameters and also mechanisms to support the implementation.
Very good, and that will drive also your work post to ICCM5, as we expect that there will be some call for further work on the strategy. The elements will be presented, but of course, the strategy will be fully developed post ICCM5 in our intersessional process. And so we will work, all these feedback will be very useful in further developing the strategy and finalizing the strategy. Thank you. I think we should have perhaps another poll questions, which I think will be more on developing countries. So the second poll, how should the capacity building strategy adapt to cater to the unique challenges faced by developing countries in the management of chemicals and waste? Should the focus be only on financial assistance? Should should it emphasize training and education specifically designed for local context? Foster partnerships with developed nations for technology and knowledge transfer? Should it prioritize infrastructure development and policy-making support? Should it develop and promote partnership that facilitates the connections of specific needs with available resources? Are all of the above with a tailored approach based on specific regional needs? And there seems that all these are very important from a developing country perspective. Few more seconds before we get the result and reflect on the result of this poll. Developing countries want it all. All of the above with a tailored approach received 80% of the vote. Training educations is important. Of course, partnership received also attention. But so there's no one focus that will, there's not one single fix that can make it all. It is again, this coordinated approach and comprehensive approach that needs to be developed if we want to be successful and if we want to respond to the developing countries' needs. Thank you. Any further remark, Marina, on your side and on the overall question 2? You're muted. You're muted, Marina.
Let me see.
Oops. Try again. We cannot hear you very clearly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, try.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Is it working?
Very
okay,
clearly
fantastic.
Now.
Yeah, I think there is a delay from my end. When I unmute my mic, it takes a few seconds. But just to note that this is really interesting because it resonates with a really important foundation of capacity building, which is there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think this is really interesting because it shows the diversity of priorities and mechanisms that can be discussed in the context of the development and design of a capacity building strategy, and really the importance that capacity building is tailored to specific contexts and specific needs. And I think this shows the diversity of needs that there are, and it's really interesting to be taken into consideration in the further discussion around capacity building. Not only interventions, but mechanisms and instruments to deliver capacity building.
Yes, thank you very much, Marina. And you can have the best technical expertise, but if you cannot sustain it in the long run within an institutional setting, if you talk only to your experts, you won't make a difference. So there is this need to have indeed this exchange of technical capacity, scientific capacity between developed and developing countries, taking the best practices here together, but remaining open to talk to non-specialists, to involve other sectors as well. I mean, all these remains very important. It's not by providing millions in one attempt that and not considering this resources in a whole for a comprehensive strategy will not make a difference and will not respond to what is required. That's, I think, quite clear. Thank you. I think we can turn to the next item, the next question. Back to you, Marina, on reporting.
No, it's on to Jerry.
To my colleague Jerry.
I'm sorry, Jerry. Jerry, welcome. I found you very, very silent so far, so it's very good to that.
Yeah. Well, We split the tasks between ourselves, Pierre. So Marina was dealing with the capacity building and I'm dealing with the reporting. So I'm assuming you can hear me okay, seeing as you're smiling. So I'm Jerry Harrison, also working with UNEP WCMC. And I'm just going to introduce now to you another of the information documents that we've been working on with the SAICM Secretariat, document on reporting. And it's interesting listening to the discussion that we've just, two of the key words that run through that is talking about a coordinated and a strategic approach. And of course, that's exactly what you need on reporting as well. You need to approach reporting in a coordinated and a strategic way. If I can have the next slide, please, Marina. So I want to stress reporting is part of a process of planning, implementation, and evaluation. At the moment, with the development of the new framework, we're looking at the planning stage. There's going to be implementation, there's going to be evaluation. And effective implementation requires an evaluation which involves monitoring, reporting, and periodic review. We need to monitor the progress, but we also need to monitor in order to identify the gaps and the limitations in implementation. The reporting process might include indicators and metrics. Could I go back to the previous slide, please? Reporting process might include indicators and metrics. And of course, the evaluation includes the periodic review and the identification of future action needed. The reason why I'm going through all this is to emphasize that reporting is not an end to itself. Reporting has to serve a purpose. We can now go to the next slide, please, Marina. So reporting is basically there are several different purposes to inform development. So in order to, I'll take one step back, I've got ahead of myself. So to inform development of a new approach to reporting for the new instrument, we've prepared the information document through looking at the existing experience under SAICM and the lessons learned from that experience, by looking at the reporting experience of a wide range of international agreements, intergovernmental agreements, and not just those in the chemicals and waste sector. We've also looked at the biodiversity sector and at the other Rio conventions, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention to Combat Desertification, because all of these have potentially valuable lessons. But we've not stopped there. We've also looked at other intergovernmental processes in different areas. For example, we looked at the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, World Health Organization, International Health Regulations. We've looked at examples of commitment platforms to look at the different ways in which information is sort of pulled in from stakeholders, different stakeholder groups. But we've also looked at the sort of reporting that's encouraged from industry, for example, through Chemical Footprint Project, the Sustainability Reporting, the GRI, and so on. Also of interest is the one of the issues under reporting to international agreements has been a lot of discussion around the potential for duplication of effort in reporting to multiple different agreements. So we've also looked at a lot of the discussion that's taken place on harmonization and streamlining of reporting processes. So all this is addressed in the information document. The information document might look rather a bit much to grab hold of, if I will, because it's about 70 pages long. But the key parts of it for moving forward are the executive summary at the beginning and the section 8 on the options for action, because those are the two key sections looking at moving things forward. A lot of the rest is basically the evidence on which that's based. So can I go to the next slide, please, Marina? So I'm just going to pull out some key facts from the document. No way I can summarize the whole document. I'm pulling out some key facts in order to sort of encourage you into discussion around this. So reporting processes can be used as a basis for a range of different things. They're about reviewing progress in implementation. Have we done what we need to do? Have we carried out the necessary activities? Have we built the necessary capacity? So these are the sort of responses relating to process, if I can put it that way. Reporting is about identification of gaps and limitations and where further action is needed. So if we've got particular gaps, particular limitations, we need to ensure our reporting processes draw these out so that we can take further action. I stress this is true at a national level or at a global level. Reporting processes can also be about reviewing impact. Are we achieving what we intended to achieve? So it's not just about reviewing progress in implementation, doing what we said we would do, but is that actually achieving our intended objectives? Reporting can be used in a targeted way to review specific themes or issues where further action may be needed, where we particularly want to identify what further action may be needed. The reporting processes themselves are also valuable in encouraging monitoring and assessment at all appropriate scales. And monitoring assessment at all appropriate levels is important for being able to evaluate what we've done and to be able to plan for the future. The reporting processes are also used in a wide range of international agreements and programs in identifying and sharing experience with others. If I can take the next slide, please, Marina. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on indicators, but indicators are often a key part of the reporting process. While they're addressed in the reporting document, of course, they're also addressed in other documents that have been put before the intersessional process, for example, by OMC. And there's going to be another document coming if it isn't already published on this. But indicators are clearly valuable in tracking progress on both process and impact. Process in terms of, are we doing what we said we were going to do or what we need to do? And impact in terms of, is that achieving what we want to achieve? But indicators can also play a role in driving change as well as in tracking it. Yes, your targets, your strategic objectives can help in identifying where we want to get, but also using the appropriate indicators can help in driving change if people are using those indicators effectively. But clearly, indicators are useful at both national and at global levels. They can be used for review and planning future action, and that is at both the national and the global levels. Are we achieving enough at the national level? Are we achieving enough as a stakeholder even? Are we achieving enough in implementing our new framework agreement? Indicators can also be used to help track access to and need for resources. Those of us involved in any international negotiations know how much resource mobilization and access to resources as an issue comes up during discussions. And tracking that can be a key way of ensuring accountability is built in. And of course, indicators have value for communications and for public awareness. So if I can go on to the next slide, please, Marina. So these, I just wanted to pull out some key characteristics that might be considered for effective reporting. These are not necessarily all sort of clustered together in the information document, but I pulled them from various places. So the reports need to, in calling for reports, you need to focus on what is needed to enhance implementation. The key issue we want to achieve through negotiation of a framework, agreement of the framework, and its implementation. The key thing we want to achieve is implementation. The reports need to focus on implementation and what can be done to improve implementation in the future. Utilization of online reporting tools can facilitate reporting, both by making it easy to report, maybe streamlining the process, but also by essentially having embedded with them an increased consistency in the reported information. Almost all of the processes, international agreements, the reporting processes within them that we looked at, have extensive guidance, support. They may have guidelines, they may have capacity building, they may have webinars, but again, the support is usually there to help those reporting to report, ease them through the process, if you will, but also again, the guidance and support itself also helps to ensure consistency in reporting, which makes it easier to use the reported information. A wide range of them now also use dashboards to encourage reporting, so that, because those dashboards can both provide feedback on who is reported, whether the reporting process is complete, and to display the reported information. And those sorts of dashboards are increasingly being used, and the most recently one being implemented is by the Minamata Convention on Mercury, where the reporting process is currently ongoing. One of the key characteristics, one of the most important aspects of the reporting process, is to make visible and effective use of reported data and information. There's nothing worse than seeing yourself writing reports and putting them in and then not seeing those reports being used. So using the reported information, whether it be online, whether it be in subsequent meetings, taking decisions, whatever, it's important not only to use the information, but to be seen to be using that information. And then running through everything I've said, running through reporting processes, running through the monitoring necessary for reporting, running through indicators and the use of indicators, is the importance of building capacity in order to be able to do it. Now, I've just selected a whole range of elements from the information document. As Pierre said, for capacity building, the issue of reporting and developing reporting for the new framework is an ongoing process. It's not something that's going to be finalized at ICCM5. So we're looking for further comment, further feedback, both now and indeed at ICCM5, in order to be able to help take this further into the future. So if Pierre, I can hand back to you, and Marina might pass on to the first question.
Thank you very much, Jerry. That was a very clear presentations where I think most of the issue of reporting, which is perceived most of the time as a painful exercise, where you have, it's a way to thank those who generously have provided you funds with and the result of project. And we see in what you presented, another dimension that is much more interesting is how these exercise could become much more creative, much more contributional to attract further interest, and where we could translate these reports into narratives that could be convincing arguments to attract the interest of non-specialists in reporting and talk to other people that are very important. We see how difficult this task for our specific mechanism is, as when you want to be comprehensive, multi-stakeholders, proactive, how difficult it is to provide a reporting mechanism that has to remain as simple as possible and describing all the progress made in a convincing manner. This is a challenging task, and it seems that you have addressed most of these dimensions. Related to your presentations, this question 3, as we consider the adoption of our new framework instruments for chemicals and management, for chemicals and waste management at ICCM5, what steps can we take to help ensure effective review of the implementations in the future at both national and international level? So what steps can we take to help ensure effective review at national and international level? How can we encourage development of an approach to monitoring, reporting, and review at all levels and engaging all stakeholders that leads to improvement in implementations? Your suggestions in this regard would be greatly appreciated. I think these questions are very well framed. and provide us with an opportunity for very interesting input. Any reaction in the chat would be welcome, and we will have poll questions in a little while. Here is the first poll questions to our third agenda item. What do you see as the most important purpose of a new reporting framework? Is it to promoting implementations efforts by countries and other stakeholders, to tracking overall implementations of the new framework instruments? Should it be identifying gaps in implementations and where further support is required? Should it be encouraging everyone involved to review the actions they are taking? What is the purpose of a new reporting framework?
Just to add a point, Pierre, while people are thinking about and ticking the boxes on there, is again to emphasize thinking about reporting as part of a process, not as something you, as you said, some burden that is placed on one individual. It needs to be seen as part of a process. And I've done a lot of work with international agreements where at times you're asked to produce a report and the answer is, well, I need resources to do the report. But to my mind, the report should be based on things that a focal point at the national level needs to know anyway in order to be able to coordinate implementation. So I think it's seeing things as part of a process is actually a very valuable step.
If we could frame such an approach, thinking that report shouldn't be only reactive, but proactive, so thinking that it shouldn't nourish the fragments, but how these fragments contribute to the sense of a whole, that is the challenge ahead of us. And if we were able to frame such a reporting mechanism, I think we would make a great step in enhancing our framework and instrument. We will close the poll in 10 seconds, and we are still welcoming any interesting input and reactions in the chat box. And here we have the result of our poll, where we see that a great majority is between promoting implementation efforts by countries and identifying gaps in implementations. And so we see here these issues of not being reactive, but proactive towards promoting the coordination, reflecting the impact of the coordinations. That seems quite interesting. Jerry, how do you read these results?
I sort of read the results as if people would have liked a box at the bottom to say all of the above. In reality, one would hope that a reporting process is able to address all of these. We're just looking to see whether anything particularly jumped out. I'm more encouraged that it's a balance across. Though, of course, only 15 people responded. While I've got the floor, I've also note the comment from Henning relating to both targets and indicators. And one of the points I'd raise, again, I would say I'm not an indicator expert, though I have worked on issues around indicators. It's also a case of making sure that the indicators do relate directly to the targets, and you don't just use an indicator because you happen to have the data, but ensuring that you've got an indicator that directly responds to what it is that you're trying to achieve and measuring that. And that can be quite an interesting task, and it's one, for example, that's being gone through at the moment under the Convention on Biological Diversity, where after they adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework last December, they adopted a monitoring framework with that but they're still working on fine-tuning some of the indicators at the moment in order to ensure it responds adequately to all of the 23 targets. And I'm sure that you're going to need to go through some phase like that in the aftermath, if I can put it that way, of ICCM5.
Yes, very well, very well said, dear Jerry. And all these issues revolving around the measurability structure will be further developed at the intersessional level once we have adopted the main targets of our new framework instrument.
But we look forward to getting in the margins of ICCM5. Also, if anybody wants discussions on them, I will be there with respect to reporting. Marina will be there with respect to capacity building. So people who are there can take the opportunity to discuss those issues with us, or indeed, obviously, with members of the Secretariat in the margins of that meeting.
Very important indeed. Okay. Should we turn to the next question, Paul? Here we are. Based on your knowledge of reporting mechanisms for other international agreements and processes, what do you think the new reporting mechanisms should prioritize? And indeed, Jerry just mentioned our biodiversity colleagues' reporting mechanisms. But so what do you think the new reporting mechanism should prioritize? Should it be online dashboard and visualization tools? Should it be support for those reporting, guidance, webinar, help desks? Should it be integration with existing reporting tools and data management system? Should it be simplified data entry, including pre-filtered data and automated review of content? So what should be prioritized? You can decide. So we see here again some technical tools, and guide me, Jerry. I'm talking under your guidance, and correct me if I'm wrong. But here are reporting tools that seems all very important. But again, after it's what do we do with the result? How do we synthesize? How do we analyze the data that could be gathered into these tools? That remains a challenge also in our reporting mechanisms in general. It's what do we do and how do we exploit at its best the value that is gathered in the number of data and information provided within our reporting effort.
Yeah, and part of that is thinking about how you're going to use the data and information in advance of asking for it. So it's a planned sequential process. You know, you
Exactly.
think about the end point and then plan the inputs based on that end point. Before we get the poll results, it's interesting. There's a comment in there about the response to question 3, which I just wanted to make a couple of points to. In the fourth progress report 2017-2019, there was some feedback on the reporting progress, which in part said that so many respondents on the survey related to that cited lack of resources actually as a response, as a reason for not reporting. But the report also covered issues like the need for provision of training and guidelines and so on. But the one point that also came up, which is also mentioned at the end of that comment, is giving feedback on reports. And it's interesting, some of the MEAs we looked at, some of the multilateral environmental agreements we looked at, do some sort of peer review on the reports that coming in. In fact, I've seen some cases where the Secretariat has done that, some cases where it's independent peer review. But some reports, like the voluntary national reports on the SDGs, go through quite a review process. They go through a process both at the national level and then in providing them to their peers within the high-level political forum and getting the feedback there. So you can build in sort of feedback processes that help in reviewing what's been done as well as what's being reported on. So yeah, very interesting comment, and interesting to look and build on that further. But it'd be useful to see the poll results now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Jerry. Simplified data. Yeah. Very interesting.
See, one of the key things we found that relating to online reporting systems is where you already have the data, for example, from a previous reporting round, you pre-fill that data and then get that to be validated and updated, was generally seen to be an effective and useful way forward. So reducing the amount of work that needs to be done.
And make the best in analyzing and synthesizing these results of reporting.
Yes.
And that's not the task of the reporter itself.
No, but they need to know it's done, and it needs to be seen to be done, so as to encourage them to actually do the reporting.
That's it, and that it will be valuable information.
Yeah.
Should we go to the next on our list today? That's the third poll questions. In developing a new reporting framework, what do you believe will be the most important things to consider? The lessons that can be learned from existing reporting systems, ensuring adaptability to future technological advances, ensuring ease of use for various stakeholders, creating a robust system that reduces potential for duplication of effort. Few more seconds, perhaps, in responding to this question, to this poll. And we will get the results very shortly now. Here we have the result, and the creating a robust system that reduces potential for duplications gathered the most vote. And this is not surprising in such a fragmented system that we have, where everybody has to report and we don't know exactly what is happening with it, and we are very often asked for the same questions and we don't know how they are used. So having a robust, that we could understand as a comprehensive system that takes care of the sense of the whole, and that is very clear, seems to make a lot of sense here. Jerry, Will you design such a robust system?
Well, I'm also looking at the comment there from Ruben Zulu. Reporting systems should be integrated with existing ones to avoid creating so many parallel systems. I mean, I totally agree. And it's one of these things we've been looking at, for example, within the biodiversity area. The interesting issue there, of course, is not all countries are a party to all agreements, and then you get differences and differences of alignment and issues because of that. It's not as straightforward as it might first sound, but I totally agree with the sentiment.
Very, very good. Do we have another question, or I think are we reaching the end of our discussion? So I think that was a very interesting. I'm very amazed, and it's always a pleasure to join this community of practice, because the quality of input, although it is very silent, but it is very substantive and very, very interesting. And I think we had a very rich discussion today with some very good, stimulating inputs and contribution. Jerry, Jerry and Marina, what is your main points and conclusions of our discussions to wrap up our discussion today?
Marina, do you want to go first, or shall I? It's difficult to get a conclusion. I mean, it's extremely useful to have input, and it's extremely useful to have views from a range of stakeholders. And of course, that is exactly the point of this sort of community of practice. We have captured what's going on here, or at least with our colleagues, we've captured what's gone through here, and we'll pick up those in the ways in which we work with the SAICM Secretariat going forward. And I just like to repeat the point: there's opportunity to make further comment and input. Indeed, I encourage you to go away, read the information documents, and come back with your further comment and input as we move forward in designing even better processes. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jerry. Marina. Your sound is not perfect. We cannot hear you properly.
Can you hear me now well?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic. Sorry about that. No, I just wanted to second my colleague Jerry and also reiterate that it's great to see the diverse and depth of the input we received today. And as Jerry mentioned, we took note of the discussions, and again, we'll be attending ICCM5. We'll be really happy to connect with any colleagues that are here today. And in terms of capacity building, as we discussed, capacity building really needs to be this iterative, long-term, tailored process. And it's really interesting to see all of those different components coming along. And we're really just keen to follow the deliberations and negotiations and see how we can continue to work together going forward. But thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Marina and Jerry. I think what we learned today is that we cannot be successful working in isolation. I think that was common to the capacity building and to the reporting. We have to consider these elements not in a narrow perspective, particularly for capacity building, narrow in terms of who contributes, who participate into it, who benefit from it, but to open it to a much wider stakeholder and being able to attract them. With regards to reporting, it's the same thing. It's not just reporting for the sake of reporting. We have to take into considerations that we are belonging to an overall architecture, that it is already a task that is heavy for many, and we have to make the best of what is existing, of avoiding these duplications, this sense of uselessness that sometimes emerge from such exercise. And if we avoid that, we can be innovative, we can be really providing additional value in our efforts to bring attention, to raise the interest of other needed partners, needed stakeholders who needs to get involved and take their responsibilities and commit in overcoming the challenges related to the sound management of chemicals and waste in the years to come. It was a great pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon, and I would like to thank all those numerous you were, as I understand, in joining this community of practice discussion. We can only thank you for your very valuable and top quality inputs and questions and comments and guidance. They will be useful. We will take them on board, consider them, and try to reflect them as pertinently as possible in the future work related to reporting and capacity building. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you very soon in Bonn. Bye-bye, and have a good weekend. Thank you.